At first light, the bell does not ring so much as breathe, a low iron exhale that loosens frost from cloaks and from the mouths of doors. Smoke lies in thin sheets along the street, and the smell of wet ash and barley porridge drifts from a cookshop whose shutters never quite close. A boy carries a basket of tallow stubs, and each step clicks against a stone that remembers older feet, older oaths. In the square, a rope hangs coiled like a sleeping animal, and pigeons keep their distance as if they have learned the alphabet of fear. A clerk's ink freezes in its horn, yet the parchment waits, pale and patient, for names to become weights. The neighbors greet one another with hands that do not quite meet, for hands have learned to measure space since the edict was nailed to the church door. It is written in a Latin few can read, but everyone knows where it points, like a finger that never trembles. The baker counts loaves as if counting debts, and the miller watches the river with the care one gives a witness who cannot be bribed. A widow brings salt and receives a glance instead of change, because glances now carry interest. The Reeves boots leave crescents in the mud, and those crescents are copied by others who want to walk like law. Somewhere a child recites a prayer that keeps losing its ending, because endings are being shortened these days. The bell breathes again, and the rope is lifted, and the square learns the sound of a rule entering flesh. No one speaks the neighbor's name, yet the name is present like smoke, and it will not be chased away by doors or by distance. When the pigeons return, they land only on the shadow of the rope, and even the shadow seems to listen. It had not always been like this. There was a time when the square knew only markets and saints' days, when a rope was for drawing water and not for measuring men. But rules have a way of changing their shoes. They arrive as prayers and leave as boots. The edict had come in winter, folded like a bird with a broken wing, nailed beside the saints who had been scrubbed pale by centuries of candles. It spoke of order, as if order were a loaf that could be cut into equal slices. It spoke of safety, as if safety were a wall that did not need a gate. And because the words were written in a tongue that made the mouth feel heavy, they were believed. Belief is lighter when it is not spoken. The clerk stands with his breath clouding the air, trying to coax ink from cold. His fingers are blue as river stones, and he rubs them as if friction could make mercy. He is not cruel. He is precise. Precision is a kind of shelter in a storm, and he has learned to build roofs out of lines. The parchment waits. It always waits. It has learned that patience is the longest thread. Names, when they are written, do not bleed. They sink. The rope, newly uncoiled, makes a sound like a throat clearing. A man from the tannery tests it with his palm and then pretends he did not. The boy with the tallow stubs sets down his basket and watches as if watching were a job that might pay him in later years. The baker's wife looks at her hands and sees flour that will not come off. The miller keeps his eyes on the river, because the river keeps no secrets, but also keeps no promises. A woman steps forward, or perhaps she is pushed by the quiet behind her. The square shifts its weight. Shoes find new edges in the mud. The widow's salt remains on the counter, a small white hill that will harden by evening. Someone coughs and is not forgiven. The bell breathes, and it is like a chest that does not know it has ribs. They do not say her name. Names have been taught to stay inside mouths. But the name moves anyway, like smoke through shutters, like cold through wool. It has a shape that fits the space between two houses where a cat once slept and now will not. It has a weight that makes the rope remember itself. The clerk writes without looking up. The ink, having been persuaded to live again, draws a line that is straighter than any road in this place. The line is a promise, and promises are sharp. The woman looks at the church door, at the saints who do not look back. She looks at the pigeons, who have learned to read shadows. She looks at the boy, who holds the smell of candle in his hands like a question. There is a moment, small as a coin, and twice as bright, when she might speak. But speech is a bridge that has been cut in winter, and the river is loud beneath it. She steps where the shadow of the rope makes a cold ladder on the stones. The sound the square makes then is not a sound that can be taught. It is not a shout. It is not a prayer. It is a door being closed in a house that will not be heated again. The bell does not ring. It breathes, as if it too has learned the economy of air. Afterward, the pigeons return to the shadow first, and then to the stone. The rope is put away, and the square pretends to remember markets. The clerk blows on his fingers and caps the ink. The parchment is rolled like a road that has decided to be a wall. The boy lifts his basket and feels older, though he does not know the word for it. The baker counts again. The miller listens to the river say nothing useful. By noon, the smoke has thinned, and the cookshop's shutters have been persuaded to behave. People begin to speak in pieces, as if sentences were now something that could be taxed. A man from the tannery swears he saw nothing, which is a kind of seeing. The widow takes her salt home and leaves a damp circle on the counter like a memory that refuses to dry. The crescents in the mud are softened by traffic, but not erased. They never are. They only become a language for those who learn to walk like law. In the afternoon, the clerk sits with a loaf that tastes like paper and reads what he has written. He does not read the names. He reads the spaces between them, the way a map reader reads the sea. He thinks of his father, who taught him letters by candle and told him that letters were ladders. He wonders when ladders became scaffolds. He closes the book and feels the cold in his bones like a debt. Toward evening, the river keeps its witness. It takes ash and gives back nothing. The miller throws a stone and counts the circles until they look like years. The boy with the tallow stubs sells the last of them and keeps one, though he does not know why. He will light it later and watch the wall breathe. He will not tell anyone what he sees. In a house near the square, a woman washes a cup that will not lose its smell. In another, a man mends a boot and finds that the leather remembers a foot that will not return. Children are told stories with the endings changed, because endings are being shortened these days. They learn to stop before the part where courage becomes expensive. And yet, under the stones, under the mud that keeps the crescents, under the river that keeps no secrets, something does not agree. It is not a plan. It is not a word. It is a grain that will not grind. The edict still points like a finger that never trembles, but fingers grow tired. Bells breathe, but chests also ache. The rope has been put away, but shadows do not belong to cupboards. Night comes as it always has, with a quiet that is not the same as peace. Candles are lit, and each flame makes a small country that refuses borders. The boy lights his last stub and watches the wall. He thinks of the square and how the pigeons read. He thinks of the clerk's blue fingers and the river's silence. He thinks of a name he does not say, and the name stays, like smoke that will not be chased away by doors or by distance. Somewhere, far from the square and close to the sound of water, a man who has learned to walk without leaving crescents in the mud stops and listens. He has been listening since winter, since the bird with the broken wing was nailed to a door. He has learned the weight of lines and the cost of breath. He does not know yet what he will do, only that the river keeps its witness and that witnesses can be gathered like stones. The bell breathes once more before sleep, and the sound goes where sound goes when it is not invited. The rope's shadow remains on the stone, faint as a memory that has decided to wait. And waiting in this place has begun to feel like a kind of promise. The square will wake again. The parchment will wait again. But the grain that will not grind has found its edge, and the next light will find more than smoke lying in thin sheets along the street. Snow has the habit of writing without ink, and this morning it has written the lanes into narrower versions of themselves. It has taken the broad gestures of yesterday and corrected them into careful lines, as if the town were a page that had offended and needed to be rewritten smaller. A woman shakes a rug and releases last night's breadcrumbs like small confessions, and a monk counts them with his eyes and not with his fingers, because numbers have become a kind of prayer and prayers have become a kind of arithmetic. The smell of sheep fat and candle smoke makes a low ceiling over the street, and under it the talk moves quietly, as if talk might bruise. At the gate, a rusted key turns with a sound like bone on bone, and the porter does not look up, because the law prefers faces that stay down. Frost has stitched a lace along the hinges. In the yard, a bird pecks at a ring of grain, then stops, then pecks again, as if practicing doubt. The snow keeps falling in pieces that look like ash, but do not behave like it. They do not remember fire. They remember height. They have been told that kinship is a map that must be redrawn, and maps make their own weather. A cooper refuses a cup, a weaver refuses a thread, and refusal becomes a second currency. It buys distance. It buys quiet. It buys the right to look away. The priest reads a passage about obedience, but the passage seems to have misplaced its mercy, and no one finds it. The words sit on the air like tools that have forgotten their handles. In a house with a low doorbeam, a girl stitches a hem and pricks her thumb, and the bead of blood looks like a seal pressed where a name should be. She licks it away and keeps sewing, because cloth does not care about names, and winter does not care about seals. The neighbor's door stays closed, not because it is locked, but because it is remembered. Somewhere a bell is wrapped in cloth so its voice will not travel, yet the silence travels anyway. By evening, the snow has erased the lanes, but not the spaces between people, and those spaces hold the cold like a promise kept too well. The town has learned to walk with its shoulders tucked. It has learned that breath can be counted, that eyes can be weighed, that a glance can be a debt that accrues interest before it is paid. Yesterday's shadow of rope still lies faint on the stones, like a bruise that has decided to become a story. The clerk's book is closed, but it is not asleep. Parchment is a patient animal. It waits to be fed. The monk, whose eyes counted crumbs, counts windows now. He knows the pattern of shutters like a rosary, knows where the paint peels and where the nails have learned to loosen. He tells himself that vigilance is love in winter, that watching is a kind of warmth. But when he passes the house with the low doorbeam, he does not look in, and the girl does not look out, and between them a corridor of unsaid things becomes a place no snow can fill. At the gate, the porter shifts his weight and listens to the key remember its work. He has been at this hinge longer than he has been married. The metal has learned his hand, and his hand has learned to pretend it does not. A man approaches with a sack of turnips and the wrong silence. The porter looks at the ground because the law prefers faces that stay down, but the ground has become a ledger, and every boot writes. He lets the man pass and keeps the sound of bone on bone in his teeth like a warning he cannot swallow. In the square, a ring of grain waits for a bird that has learned to doubt. Children draw maps in the snow with sticks and then erase them with their feet, because erasing is faster than explaining. The cooper mends a barrel and refuses a cup of hot water. The weaver ties off a thread and refuses a word. Refusal is easier than refusal used to be. It has learned to walk without leaving crescents in the mud. The priest's passage about obedience hangs in the nave like a net that has forgotten the sea. A woman listens and hears her mother's voice inside the words. Here's the way names used to be spoken when they were still doors and not stones. A man listens and hears only the parts that fit in his pockets. When the bell does not ring, they notice. When it does not breathe, they notice more. The cloth around it has made a winter of sound, and winter is good at keeping things. In the afternoon, the clerk opens his book and finds that the ink has not forgiven the cold. He rubs his hands and thinks of ladders, of how his father said letters were rungs and rungs were choices. He thinks of scaffolds and does not like the thought, so he counts lines instead. He writes a note to himself in the margin and then crosses it out, because margins have become a place where accidents live. He looks out the window and sees the snow correct a footprint into a rumor. The girl with the pricked thumb finishes the hem and holds it up to the light that pretends to be noon. The stitch is straight. It will outlast her patience. She thinks of the neighbor's door and how it used to open like a mouth that knew her name. She thinks of the bead of blood and how it looked like a seal pressed where a name should be. She does not think of the rope. Thinking has learned to avoid certain rooms. Toward dusk, the bird returns to the ring of grain and eats as if eating were a promise that could be kept. The porter closes the gate and hears the key say its old, thin prayer. Smoke lowers its ceiling. Sheep fat and candle smoke make the air a cloth that can be wrung. The monk walks home with a book under his arm and the crumbs still counted behind his eyes. He tells himself that silence is a discipline. He does not tell himself what discipline has begun to cost. A man who has learned to walk without leaving crescents in the mud stands near the river and watches the snow choose where to land. He is not from here, but he has been here long enough to learn the names that are no longer spoken. He has learned the grammar of doors that stay closed because they are remembered. He has learned the sound a bell makes when it is rapped, and how that sound moves anyway. He has learned that maps, once redrawn, do not ask permission to become weather. He picks up a stone and throws it into the water and counts the circles until they look like years. He thinks of witnesses and how they are gathered, not like grain, but like cold. He thinks of the clerk's blue fingers, of the porter's hinge, of the girl's bead of blood. He thinks of the ring of grain and the bird practicing doubt. He does not think of courage, because courage is a word that has begun to bruise. He thinks of weight. In the houses, candles are lit, and each flame makes a small country that refuses borders. The cooper drinks water alone. The weaver knots thread and then unties it, because habit has learned to hesitate. The priest closes the book and listens to the knave remember voices. The clerk caps the ink and feels the day sit in his bones like a debt. The girl folds the hem and puts it away, and the place where she pricked her thumb becomes a story she does not tell. Night comes with a quiet that is not the same as peace. Snow keeps writing without ink, and the town keeps reading without eyes. Somewhere, a bell stays rapped, and its silence travels like a road that has decided to be a river. The neighbor's door remains closed, and in the space between houses, the cold holds its breath as if waiting for a name. By morning, the lanes will be narrower again, and the map will ask for another line. The man by the river will still be listening. The bird will still be practicing doubt. The clerk's book will still be patient. And in the square, where the ring of grain remembers a circle, something will begin to remember how to open. Not a door, not a mouth, but a question that has learned to keep its edges. The snow will not answer. It never does. But it will keep writing, and what it writes will be read by feet before it is read by eyes, and the next light will find the town measuring itself for a story it has not yet agreed to tell. The river carries a mirror that never agrees, and today it shows a bridge crowded with boots that hesitate at the same plank. The water is dark with last night's snowmelt, and it moves like a thought that has learned to keep its teeth. Tar and wet rope make the air taste bitter, and the ferryman's hands smell like iron, because he has been touching coins and also chains, and iron remembers both. He stands with one foot on the quay and one in the boat, and feels the day decide which side it will favor. A crier reads from a board hung crooked, and the words lean as if they have been tired a long time. They lean into the wind, and the wind refuses to hold them. Children chase a hoop that wobbles like a question, and the hoop rolls into a shadow where questions are not retrieved. On the quay, a basket of eels stirs, and the stirring sounds like a small applause that no one claims. The river pretends not to hear. From the far bank, smoke comes like a letter with its address smudged. From the near bank, people come like sentences that have been cut short. A guildman counts his apprentices as if counting ribs, and the count changes when the law is remembered aloud. He touches each boy's shoulder as if checking for breath, and then takes his hand away as if breath were contagious. The bridge has a toll now that is not paid in silver, and the tollkeeper's eyes have learned to look through sleeves. He looks at wrists the way a butcher looks at bone. The ferryman hears the board creak under boots and thinks of knots. He thinks of the way rope learns a hand and then refuses to forget it. He thinks of the knot he tied this morning and how it did not want to be untied, how it held like a mouth that has decided to keep a secret. He unties it anyway because secrets have a way of turning into weights, and weights have a way of choosing where they fall. A woman crosses with a veil that hides a bruise and reveals nothing else, and the veil becomes a border no map records. She walks as if the bridge were a narrow year, and each step were a month that might not open. The tollkeeper looks through her sleeve and sees what he wants to see. He does not see the bruise. He sees the idea of a bruise, and ideas are easier to tax. The ferryman watches the river refuse to agree with her reflection and wonders which of them is more honest. In a tavern near the quay, bread is broken and not shared, which is a kind of arithmetic the room understands. A man eats and keeps his eyes on his hands as if his hands might betray him to his mouth. A woman counts her coins twice and then hides them where her heart used to be loud. The air smells like old beer and newer fear. Someone laughs, and the laugh has a corner in it where it can be folded and put away. The crier turns the board, and on the back is a mark that looks like a bird but is red like a gate. The mark has been learning to be both. It has learned to look like a promise and to sound like a hinge. The crier's voice catches on it the way a sleeve catches on a nail. He reads again, and this time the words do not lean. They stand, and standing is more dangerous. A child stops chasing the hoop and watches it spin itself tired in the shadow, and then the child looks at the river as if the river might answer. On the bridge, a man with a sack of turnips hesitates at the plank that remembers yesterday. He shifts his weight and feels the board answer with a sound that has a future in it. The tollkeeper's eyes look through his sleeves and find the place where a story might be hidden. The man opens his mouth and closes it again, because mouths have begun to feel like doors, and doors have begun to remember. He pays in the way he has been taught to pay, and the sack of turnips feels heavier, though nothing has been added. The guildman finishes counting and loses one. He does not lose a boy. He loses a number. Numbers have begun to be easier to lose than names. He tells himself this is a relief. He tells himself that ribs are safer when they are not counted. One of the apprentices watches the river and thinks of circles that do not close. He thinks of the ring of grain in the square and the bird practicing doubt. He thinks of the snow writing without ink and the town reading without eyes. He thinks of leaving and does not know where to put the thought. The ferryman takes a coin and feels the chain in it. He takes a chain and feels the coin in it. His hands have learned to confuse them. He remembers a time when the bridge asked only for feet and the river asked only for patience. He remembers when knots were stories told at the end of a day and not stories that chose listeners. He remembers a bell wrapped in cloth and how silence traveled anyway. Memory has begun to feel like a ferry that leaves without him. A pair of soldiers pass, and their boots speak before they do. The bridge listens. The river refuses to agree. The crier's board creaks, and the mark on its back looks briefly like a bird that might take off, and then like a gate that will not. The woman with the veil has crossed, and on the far bank she pauses as if waiting for her reflection to catch up. It does not. She touches her cheek where the bruise lives and feels only the cloth and the idea of skin. On the quay, the basket of eels stirs again, and the small applause goes unanswered. A fishmonger looks at them and thinks of sermons that have learned to move. He thinks of nets and how they pretend to be doors. He thinks of the way water takes a shape and then forgets it. He does not think of the bridge. Thinking has learned to keep certain distances. In the tavern, a man breaks bread and then breaks the silence and then regrets both. The room absorbs the sound the way it absorbs smoke. A woman at the back table folds her hands and unfolds them and finds that neither shape fits. The keeper wipes a cup and listens to the river through the wall, because walls have learned to be thin where they are needed. When the river darkens, it is not because the sun has gone, but because the bridge has decided who it will remember. The planks hold some boots and forget others. The tollkeeper writes nothing and counts everything. The crier reads again, and the words stand and then lean and then fall back into themselves like men who have walked too long. The ferryman unties his rope and feels the knot still in his palm, and he keeps that knot like a story that has chosen a listener. He does not tell it. Stories have learned to wait. He pushes off, and the boat makes a sound like a thought letting go. The river takes him and shows him a face that is not his, and then shows him another, and then shows him none. He thinks of the clerk's blue fingers, and the girl's bead of blood, and the porter's hinge, and the ring of grain. He thinks of the man by the river who counts circles like years. He thinks of witnesses and how they are gathered like cold. On the bridge, the last boots hesitate and then decide. The hoop lies in the shadow and waits to be a question again. The mark on the crier's board looks like a bird and is read like a gate, and the reading becomes a habit. The guildman closes his ledger and feels a rib he did not know he had. The woman with the veil walks into smoke and becomes a line in a map no one keeps. Night comes, and the river keeps its mirror, and the mirror keeps its disagreement. Candles are lit on both banks, and each flame makes a small country that refuses borders. The ferryman ties his rope and unties it and leaves it untied, because knots have begun to choose their own endings. He stands and listens to the bridge remember. He listens to the town measure itself for a story it has not yet agreed to tell. Somewhere beyond the far bank, a road waits to be named, and naming has begun to feel like a promise that will need witnesses. The man who walks without leaving crescents in the mud is listening, and the river is practicing the shape of a door. The next light will not ask whether the bridge is ready. It will only ask who. Morning enters the cloister through a window that has learned the shape of dust, and the dust answers with a slow gold. The light does not hurry. It moves the way a hand moves over a fevered brow, testing, retreating, returning. A bell coughs and recovers, and the sound touches stone as if stone could be persuaded to remember warmth. The air holds the smell of cold ash and old parchment. Somewhere, water finds a crack and keeps it. In the scriptorium, a novice warms ink with his breath, and the breath fogs the margin where a decree waits like a blade in its sheath. The page has learned to be patient. It knows the way iron learns a hand. The novice's fingers are red and careful, and he tells himself that letters are ladders, though lately ladders have begun to look like scaffolds. He blots once, too hard, and the blot becomes a small country with no borders. He thinks of crossing it, and does not. Outside, carts pass with the soft complaint of wood, and the complaint is answered by crows that have memorized the schedule of absence. They know when the yard will empty, and when it will fill. They know which sounds are promises, and which are only habits. A gardener trims a yew into a wall that pretends to be mercy. The clippings fall like dark snow, and the ground keeps them without comment. They say the rule is old as nails, but nails are new every day. The abbot reads aloud, and the words fall in a line that resembles a road, and roads are always choosing who arrives. His voice has learned to travel without leaving footprints. The monks listen with their heads bowed, not because humility has become easier, but because looking has become a kind of answer. The rule speaks of order as if order were a room that could be closed. It speaks of care as if care were a ledger that could be balanced. A tanner brings hides that smell of rain and work, and he is asked for a name he does not carry in his pocket. He pats his apron and finds only the day's weight. He says a name anyway, because saying is cheaper than carrying, and the clerk writes it as if writing were a kind of keeping. The hides are stacked like sleep, and the smell stays after he leaves, the way a memory stays after a door is shut. In the refectory, soup steams and no one leans close enough to be warmed by another's bowl. Spoons make small, careful sounds. A monk counts his sips the way one counts steps on a narrow stair. He remembers when warmth was a thing that could be shared and not measured. He remembers a bridge and a river that would not agree. He remembers a bell wrapped in cloth and the way silence traveled anyway. He eats and feels the rule sit in his chest like a second rib. A girl carries water and listens to the echo inside the bucket, and the echo tells her which doors are already closed. The bucket swings and the water answers with a thin, bright ring that does not belong to the cloister, but has learned to pass through it. She thinks of the market and the hoop that wobbled like a question and rolled into a shadow where questions were not retrieved. She thinks of a veil and a bruise that became a border. She does not think of the rope. Thinking has learned to avoid certain rooms. When the bell rings again, it does not gather the monks so much as separate them by the way they stand. Some move as if the floor were a river. Some move as if it were a map. The novice in the scriptorium caps the ink and feels the cold climb back into his fingers. He looks at the margin where the decree waits and sees not a blade, but the idea of a blade, which is sharper because it does not need a sheath. In the garden, the trimmed yew throws a shadow like a fence, and the fence has learned to call itself necessary. The abbot walks there with a book under his arm and stops where the shadow pretends to be a line. He thinks of roads and how they choose. He thinks of bridges and how they remember. He thinks of names and how they sink. He tells himself that necessity is a kind of mercy, and mercy is a kind of silence, and silence is a kind of order. The yew does not answer. It keeps its shape. The novice returns to his page and begins to copy, because copying is a way to survive a morning. His letters stand and then lean and then stand again. He hears the carts complain and the crows answer. He hears the bucket ring and the soup steam. He hears the rule and does not hear the space it leaves. He writes the words as if they were stones in a wall and then looks at the wall and wonders who will be kept out. In a side chapel, a candle is lit and the flame makes a small country that refuses borders. A monk kneels and feels the floor remember knees. He prays for obedience and finds that the prayer has misplaced its mercy. He prays for mercy and finds that the prayer has learned a new shape. He stays because staying is a habit that has learned to call itself faith. The tanner's hides are salted and stacked. The salt bites. The bite keeps. The clerk closes his book and feels the inks cold like a debt. He thinks of the ferryman's hands that smelled of iron because they had touched coins and also chains. He thinks of the knot that stayed in the palm. He thinks of witnesses and how they are gathered like cold. He does not think of names. Names have begun to feel like doors that do not open from this side. At noon, light makes a promise and keeps only half of it. The garden wall of yew holds its shadow. The novices pass with eyes lowered and sleeves careful. The girl with the bucket sets it down and hears the echo stop. She feels the quiet settle like dust and knows that dust remembers the shape of windows. She looks at the cloister and sees a map that has been redrawn so many times it has begun to call itself weather. The abbot reads again, and the words fall like tools that have forgotten their handles. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. The room leans. The rule speaks of old nails and new hands. It speaks of gates that look like birds and birds that are red like gates. It speaks of tolls that are not paid in silver. Some of the monks understand the words. Some understand the spaces between them. Both understand that understanding has become a kind of choosing. In the afternoon, a messenger arrives with mud on his boots that does not belong to this yard. The mud has a river in it. It has a bridge in it. It has a story that has chosen a listener. He does not speak in the garden. He waits for the abbot, because waiting is a form of obedience that looks like patience. When he speaks, he keeps his eyes on the yew's shadow. He says little is enough. The abbot nods and feels the road choose again. He looks at the novice's page and at the margin where the decree waits like a blade in its sheath. He looks at the garden wall and at the fence that calls itself necessary. He looks at the girl's bucket and at the echo that has learned which doors are already closed. He tells himself that order is a bridge. He tells himself that bridges are mercies. He tells himself that mercy is a rule that can be learned. Evening comes and the bell rings, and this time the sound does not separate so much as arrange. Candles are lit, and each flame makes a small country that refuses borders. The soup is thinner, and no one leans closer. The novice closes his book and feels the day settle into his bones like a map he will be asked to follow. The gardener sweeps the clippings and leaves the shadow. Shadows have learned to stay. Night finds the cloister in a quiet that is not the same as peace. The window keeps its dust. The dust keeps its gold. The decree keeps its edge. Beyond the wall, the river keeps its mirror, and the mirror keeps its disagreement. Somewhere, a bridge remembers boots and forgets faces. Somewhere, a knot waits in a palm like a story that has chosen a listener. Before sleep, the girl looks at the bucket and listens for the echo and hears only herself. She thinks of doors and how they decide. She thinks of roads and how they choose. She does not think of names. Names have begun to feel like a toll that is not paid in silver. The bell breathes once and rests. The yew holds its fence-shaped shadow. The abbot closes his book and opens a window. And Cold writes without ink. Tomorrow will ask for another line. The page will be patient. The river will not agree. And the rule, old as nails and new as hands, will wait to be carried across a bridge that has begun to decide who it will remember. A market can smell like a forest if the forest has learned coin, and today it smells of apples, leather, and a worry that does not rot. The air is sweet and animal and edged with iron. It holds the morning the way a net holds light, by accident and with consequences. The cobbles are damp from a night that did not finish its sentences, and boots leave prints that look like questions asked by the ground. The scales are wiped with a cloth that has seen better measures, and the weights keep their secrets. A hand tests a balance and withdraws as if the metal were warm. The butcher sharpens his knife and listens to the sound as if it were a verdict practicing its name. Each stroke is a small winter. Each pause is a summer that has learned to wait. He thinks of bridges and tolls and the way eyes have begun to look through sleeves. He thinks of the word that stands behind his counter and how it has learned to stand without leaning. Near the well, a fiddler plays, and the tune is old enough to remember when water was shared without asking who had drawn it first. The bow moves like a prayer that has lost its mouth. Children gather and then drift, because drifting is easier than choosing. Chalk marks appear on a wall and then are rubbed away, leaving ghosts that look like doors in a dream. The wall keeps the shape of them for a moment, and then it pretends it never knew. A woman counts eggs and hears the count change when a neighbor's shadow passes. She counts again and tells herself that numbers are honest. She tells herself that shadows are only weather. The ordinance is spoken like weather, and weather always finds a way to be believed. It comes in sentences that do not ask and does not stay to hear answers. A crier's voice has learned to be a cloud. In a stall of ribbons, colors are chosen with care that resembles caution, and caution has become a style. Blue is held up and then put down as if it were cold. Red is touched and then not. The seller smiles and does not. She has learned to smile the way a door learns to stay. A boy is sent for salt and returns with a story he is told not to repeat, and the story learns to live in his pockets. It rubs against coins and makes a sound that is not money. The well bucket rises and brings up not only water, but the reflection of a face that decides to look away. The water keeps the face for a heartbeat and then forgets it. Someone coughs. Someone laughs and folds the laugh where it will not be seen. The fiddler's tune thins and then thickens again like smoke finding a ceiling. At noon, the bell's shadow points at a house and then moves, but the pointing is remembered longer than the moving. A man follows the shadow with his eyes and feels the ground tilt. He tells himself that shadows are only maps for light, and maps have begun to make their own weather. He tells himself to buy apples and does not. The butcher wraps a cut and counts the coins with fingers that smell like iron. He looks at the boy with the salt and sees the story bulge like a bruise. He does not ask. Asking has become a form of purchase no one wants to make. The boy feels the weight in his pocket and thinks of the bridge and the river that would not agree, of the crier's board with the mark that looked like a bird and was read like a gate. He thinks of the knot in the ferryman's palm and how knots choose listeners. A woman with a veil passes, and the veil is a border no map records. Someone says her name and then does not, because names have begun to feel like tolls not paid in silver. The ribbon seller rearranges her colors so that caution looks like taste. The egg counter pays and keeps her eyes on the cloth that wipes the scales. The cloth has learned more than it says. The ordinance arrives again, this time in a whisper that has learned to walk. It moves through stalls and under tables and into pockets where stories live. It says what the weather says when it is about to be believed. It says to look and not see, to count and not name, to choose and not ask why. The market answers with the sound of breathing that counts. A man from the tanner's yard brings a strip of leather that smells of rain and work. He asks for thread and is given silence first, then thread. He ties the strip and feels the knot resist and then agree. He thinks of the abbot's garden and the yew that throws a fence-shaped shadow and calls it necessary. He thinks of the novice warming ink with breath and the margin where a decree waited like a blade. He does not think of the word for blade. Children chase a hoop again, and the hoop wobbles like a question and rolls toward the well. It stops at the lip and leans and then stays, as if the water had a hand in it. The fiddler plays a note that is not in the tune and then returns to the tune as if returning were a habit that had learned to call itself choice. A woman buys apples and counts them and hears the count change when a shadow passes. She does not look up. The crier's voice fades and the wall keeps its ghosts. The butcher's knife rests and the edge keeps its light. The ribbon seller's colors settle into a pattern that looks like a decision. The boy with the salt walks past the house the bell pointed to and feels the story in his pocket grow heavier. He tells himself it is only salt. Across the square, a man who has learned to walk without leaving crescents in the mud pauses and listens. He listens to the market count itself. He listens to the well forget a face. He listens to the ordinance pretend to be weather. He listens to the fiddler remember when water was shared. He does not speak, because speaking has begun to feel like a bridge that will remember you longer than you remember it. A woman drops a coin and it rolls and stops at the edge of a chalk ghost that looks like a door. She bends to pick it up and hesitates, because doors have learned to decide. She picks it up and keeps her hand closed around it longer than she needs to. The market shifts, and the shifting has a sound like a net tightening. At the scales, the cloth wipes again, and the weights keep their secrets. The egg counter leaves and does not look back. The butcher wraps another cut and hears the sound of sharpening in his head. The ribbon seller sells blue and does not sell red. The fiddler stops, and the market hears itself breathing, and that breathing counts. The well bucket rises and falls and brings up only water. The water shows no face and keeps no promise. The bell's shadow moves off the house and points at stone and then at nothing. The pointing is remembered. A door stays closed not because it is locked, but because it is remembered. Evening begins to fold the light and put it away. The ordinance is folded with it and placed where pockets keep stories. The boy with the salt walks home and feels the story choose him again. He thinks of telling it and does not. He thinks of keeping it and does. Keeping has become a skill. As stalls close, the market smells less like a forest and more like a room that has been used. Apples go into sacks. Leather goes into shadow. The worry that does not rot stays. The man who walks without crescents turns toward the river and listens to the bridge remember boots. He listens to the town measure itself for a story it has not yet agreed to tell. When night comes, candles will make small countries that refuse borders. The well will keep its dark. The wall will keep its ghosts. The cloth will keep wiping, and the weights will keep their secrets. Somewhere, a bell will breathe and not gather so much as separate. And in a pocket, a story will wait, warm from a boy's hand, deciding whether it will be told or whether it will become a knot that chooses a listener in the dark. Dusk makes a soft ledger of windows, and each window keeps a column of light that must be balanced by night. The town is being counted without numbers. Smoke lays a low roof over the street, and under it footsteps sound like coins set down and taken back. In a hall that smells of rushes and old vows, a judge rubs wax between his fingers and thinks about seals the way others think about bread. The wax yields and resists, and he likes that it remembers both. The floor holds scuffs like punctuation, and the sentences of boots continue without asking to be read. A messenger's cloak carries rain, and the rain carries news that does not knock. It enters by the hinge and leaves by the breath. The man's boots speak first, then fall quiet, as if even leather has learned to listen. Somewhere a dog learns to wait and calls it loyalty. The dog's ribs show like parentheses, holding a small sentence of hunger between them. The hall is not large, but it has learned to feel heavy. Rushes are laid as if comfort could be arranged in rows. Old vows cling to the beams and drop like dust when voices rise. A candle is lit and makes a small country that refuses borders. The flame leans, as if it knows which way the words will go. They bring a ledger that is heavier than wood, and the room leans toward it as if toward a fire. The binding has learned the shape of hands that do not tremble. When it is set down, the table answers with a sound like a door trying not to remember. Names are entered, and the entering sounds like doors trying not to creak. Each scratch of the quill is a small winter, and each pause is a summer that has learned to wait. A woman stands with her hands folded because hands have been instructed, and instruction has learned to sit in the bones. She does not look at the judge. She looks at the edge of the table where the wax has dripped and hardened into a shape that could be a bird or a gate. She thinks of the market and the bell's shadow pointing and then moving, and how the pointing stayed longer than the moving. She thinks of the well's water and the face that decided to look away. She keeps her hands folded because unfolding them feels like a sound. A man speaks and finds that the room has already spoken for him, and the echo refuses to give back his words. He says he was there and not there, that he saw and did not see, that he carried and was carried. The hall receives his sentences the way a wall receives chalk, by remembering the outline longer than the hand. The judge listens and rubs the wax and thinks of seals the way others think of bread. Because seals are eaten by documents, and documents are a kind of hunger. The clerk writes, his ink has learned to be patient, but patience is a kind of waiting that costs. He writes names the way one writes bridges, careful with spans, careful with what is allowed to pass. He writes and hears the ferryman's knot in his palm, hears the market count itself, hears the bell breathe. He does not look up when the quill pauses. Pauses have begun to feel like tolls. When the seal is pressed, wax remembers heat and forgets mercy. The sound is not loud, but it is complete. It closes something that had not yet decided to be open. The judge lifts the seal and looks at it as if it were a loaf and he had already broken it. He sets it down and feels the table answer. The ledger keeps the warmth for a moment and then becomes what it was before, a book that has learned to hold weight. Outside, a bell rings for evening and the ring walks the street, tapping shoulders that do not answer. Windows add their columns of light and then subtract them. A woman pulls her shawl and feels the cold decide. A man counts steps and finds that the ground has been counting him. Somewhere the dog waits, and the waiting becomes a shape that fits beside the door. Inside, the woman with folded hands is told she may sit or stand, and she chooses to remain what she is. Choice has begun to feel like a story told by someone else. The man who spoke finds his voice in the rafters and leaves it there. The messenger dries his cloak and watches the steam leave like a memory that has decided to go. He thinks of roads and how they choose who arrives. He thinks of bridges and how they remember boots and forget faces. The judge rubs the wax again and thinks of bread. He thinks of the abbot's garden and the yew that throws a fence-shaped shadow and calls it necessary. He thinks of the decree waiting in a margin like a blade in its sheath. He thinks of weather and how it learns to be believed. He tells himself that seals are mercies because they end arguments. He does not tell himself what they begin. The clerk turns a page and the sound is a small river. He writes and feels the ink's cold like a debt. He remembers the novice warming ink with breath and the way breath fogged the margin. He remembers the girl with the bucket, listening to the echo and learning which doors were already closed. He writes, and the ledger becomes heavier, not with wood, but with the way wood learns to keep. A murmur moves through the hall and then decides not to be a sound. The rushes shift. The candle leans and straightens. The woman's hands remain folded. The man's mouth remains open and then closes. The judge nods and does not nod. The messenger's boots remember rain. Outside, the street keeps the bell's ring and spends it on corners. A child follows the sound and stops where the shadow of a door is darker. He thinks of a hoop that rolled into a shadow and stayed a question. He thinks of a boy with salt and a story that learned to live in pockets. He does not think of telling. Telling has begun to feel like crossing a bridge that will remember you longer than you remember it. The dog waits and learns the measure of patience by the way footsteps pass and do not pass. The waiting becomes a place. The place becomes a habit. The habit becomes a word no one uses. Back in the hall, the ledger is closed and opened again, because endings have begun to be provisional. The clerk reads what he has written and hears only the spaces between the names. The judge presses his thumb into the wax's memory and leaves no mark. He thinks of seals and bread and hunger. He thinks of a market that smelled like apples and leather and a worry that does not rot. He thinks of a bridge that decided who it would remember. The woman is told she may go. She does not go at once. She looks at the table and the wax and the ledger and the candle's small country. She looks at the door and feels the dog's waiting as if it were her own. She unfolds her hands and the room hears it as a sound. She leaves and the hall does not follow her. The man who spoke is told to wait. He waits and feels the waiting become a shape that fits beside the door. He hears the bell outside spend itself on the street. He hears the clerk turn a page. He hears the judge rub wax. He hears the rushes remember feet. He does not hear his own words return. The messenger leaves and carries less rain and more quiet. He thinks of roads and bridges and how the river keeps its mirror and the mirror keeps its disagreement. He thinks of the man who walks without leaving crescents in the mud and listens. He thinks of witnesses and how they are gathered like cold. Night finishes balancing the windows. The columns of light are closed. The hall keeps one flame and then keeps none. The ledger is set where it will be found again. The seal sleeps and remembers heat. The dog remains by the door and the waiting remains with the dog. In a house nearby, someone lights a candle and counts breaths. In another, someone counts coins and hears the count change when a shadow passes. The town is being measured for a story it has not yet agreed to tell. The bell's ring is a memory that walks. In the hall, the judge stands alone for a moment and listens to the room remember. He touches the table and feels the scuffs like punctuation. He thinks of sentences of boots and roads that choose. He thinks of mercy and finds that the word has moved. He leaves and the door learns him. Outside, the dog shifts and keeps waiting. The waiting fits. The street holds its quiet. Somewhere, a bridge keeps boots and forgets faces. Somewhere, a river practices the shape of a door. And somewhere between the ledger and the bell, a question has been sealed, not to be kept, but to be carried into a morning that will ask who it will remember. Night arrives with a cloth, and the cloth is laid carefully over roofs that know how to keep secrets. It does not fall. It is placed, as one places a hand over a mouth to keep a story from escaping. Windows become dark ledgers again, their columns of light closed and counted away. Smoke thins and then thickens, learning the shape of alleys. Somewhere, a bell is still remembering how to breathe, but it does not try. In a narrow house, a woman trims a wick and saves the cuttings in a cup that once held honey. The cup still remembers sweetness, and the memory makes the room kinder than it is. The smell of beeswax and damp wool makes a small country inside the room, and in that country, a child learns the map of a ceiling by heart. The beams are rivers. The cracks are roads. The dark is a border that refuses to be named. The woman's hands are steady because they have been taught to be, and teaching has learned to sit in the bones. A knock is rehearsed somewhere and then forgotten, and forgetting becomes a skill. The neighbor's steps pass and do not pass, and both are heard. Sound has begun to behave like weather, believed but not invited. The child asks, without asking, if the door will stay. The woman answers, without answering, by setting the cup behind a board that has learned to keep quiet. They have learned the law as one learns a hymn, by repetition, and by the parts where breath is taken away. The words are known even when they are not spoken. They sit in the chest like a second set of ribs. A loaf is broken and wrapped again, as if bread could be taught to be private. Crumbs are counted like witnesses and then swept into a corner where corners keep their own stories. In the alley, a bell is muffled with rope, and the rope leaves a pattern that looks like writing no one admits to reading. The pattern holds for a moment and then becomes only rope again, but the wall remembers. Walls have learned to remember better than people. A bird startles and strikes the wall, and the wall keeps the feather like a signature. The feather trembles once, and then decides to stay. In the church porch, a list is posted and covered with ash, and ash is a language that erases while pretending to explain. Someone has written names as if names were bridges. Someone else has scattered ash as if bridges could be made into fog. A man stops and reads with his eyes lowered, and then looks away, because looking has begun to feel like a form of agreement. The list keeps its quiet, and the ash keeps its work. The woman in the narrow house listens to the street count itself. She hears a cart complain, and a door learn to be a door. She hears the river in the distance practicing the shape of a mirror that will not agree. She hears the dog by the hall fit itself to waiting. She hears the ledger's weight without seeing it. She does not hear her own name, and that is both a relief and a bruise. Before sleep, she hides the wick trimmings and keeps one, because light remembers what it costs. She places it where the child will not find it, and where she will. The child watches and learns the map of that place too. The candle is lit and then is not, and the room keeps the small country it made as a rumor. Outside, the cloth of night does not move, yet beneath it doors learn to choose, and choosing learns to call itself peace. A man walks the long way home so that his boots will have time to forget. He passes the alley where the rope left its writing and does not look. He passes the church porch and feels the ash without touching it. He tells himself that peace is a place you can reach by not going there. In another house, a woman counts breaths and finds the count change when a shadow passes the window. She counts again and tells herself that numbers are honest. She tells herself that shadows are only weather. Weather has begun to be believed. She puts out the candle, and the dark arrives like a book that has learned her name. Down by the river, the ferryman ties his rope and unties it and leaves it untied. Knots have begun to choose their own endings. He keeps one in his palm anyway, because stories need hands. He listens to the bridge remember boots and forget faces. He listens to the water refuse to agree with what it shows. He thinks of the market counting itself and the well forgetting a face. He thinks of seals and bread and hunger. Near the hall, the dog remains and keeps waiting. The waiting fits beside the door like a second threshold. The door opens and closes and opens again, and the dog does not move, because loyalty has learned to be still. The hall keeps one candle and then keeps none. The ledger sleeps and remembers heat. The seal sleeps and forgets mercy. A messenger passes with less rain in his cloak and more quiet in his pockets. He thinks of roads and how they choose who arrives. He thinks of bridges and how they remember longer than people do. He thinks of the man who walks without leaving crescents in the mud and listens. He does not speak, because speaking has begun to feel like paying a toll in breath. In the narrow house, the child traces the ceiling's rivers and roads again, and then stops where the dark is thickest. The woman listens for the rehearsed knock and hears only the neighbor's steps passing and not passing. She thinks of the bell's shadow pointing and then moving. She thinks of the market's worry that does not rot. She thinks of the list under ash and the way ash pretends to explain. She keeps the wick trimming in her hand and feels its small weight argue with the dark. Somewhere, a window opens and closes, and the sound is a small sentence that does not ask to be read. Somewhere, a spoon is set down and the sound counts. Somewhere, a ribbon is untied and becomes only cloth. The town is being measured in breaths. The cloth of night holds. It holds the roofs and the secrets they have learned to keep. It holds the alley's writing and the wall's feather. It holds the list and the ash and the way names sink. It holds the river's disagreement and the bridge's memory. It holds the dog's waiting and the ferryman's not. In the church porch, a man returns and brushes ash aside and then puts it back, because touching has become a question he does not want to answer. He reads with his eyes and not with his mouth. He leaves, and the porch keeps his outline for a moment like chalk and then pretends it never knew. The woman lies down and keeps the wick trimming near as if it were a coin that remembers fire. The child sleeps and dreams of doors that choose and of maps that move. The woman does not sleep at once. She listens to the town practice being quiet. She listens to the law hum like a hymn with the breath taken away. She listens to peace learn a new shape. Toward morning, the cloth will be lifted and folded, and the windows will open their ledgers again. The bell will remember how to breathe. The list will either remain under ash or not. The river will still refuse to agree. The bridge will still decide who it remembers. The market will still smell like apples and leather and a worry that does not rot. For now, the night keeps its careful cover. Beneath it, doors continue to learn. Somewhere, a question that has been sealed is being carried by a hand that does not yet know it is a witness. And somewhere between the rope's writing and the wick's small weight, the town is choosing what it will call peace and what it will have to call something else.